Hello, welcome to today's video. What we're going to be looking at is part 3 of our Alteryx functions. We'll be looking at the date time functions. If you're checking in on this one just first, I recommend that you go back to at least part 1 because I give a little bit better overview of how to use functions, how to develop your functions, test your functions. But within this part 3, we're going to jump right into the date time functions and leave some of the preliminary work to you doing a review of part 1. We'll talk about what else we're going to do because I also want to cover the crew macros. Crew macros are built inside of the Alteryx system as an add-on. They are not part of Alteryx, but a separate group of people that manage these and maintain them. The Alteryx community supports them very heavily, and if you check out this web link, it shows you a little bit about, or explains a little bit about the crew macros that are inside of the Alteryx community for a link, and that can take you to the installation. I will post this link inside of the comments for this video so that you can get to it more quickly, or you can just simply search for crew macros. So let's jump right into our video. Workflow. So what we're going to look at here very quickly for the first function is going to be looking at the date time now that you might need to keep a timestamp for what's going on within your workflow. We're going to be using the Daisy Hill Puppy training view if you're questioning about the view that I did to denormalize the puppy data mart inside of my data warehouse. Please check out part 2. But what I want to do here is simply look at one of the widgets. It's here inside of in-out. It is the date time now. It allows you to choose a format and get the date time that this workflow actually began running. If you choose the default format, here you can click on all different formats. You can choose something that's much more visual than the standard computerish kind of date time. But if you choose the default, this is the default Alteryx format, then you can within your select widget simply change it to a date time and now have a date time. To get this into my workflow, I need to append it to each of my records, which I've done here. So now this actually gets me the current date time that the workflow was run associated with each of the records of data, so you can use it to store it in your data warehouse or to do some reporting from. We also have a formula function called DateTimeNow that also returns the date time, and if you set it to date time, you will get the current date time this way as well, appended to each of your records as they come through. You may think that this is a much easier way to get the date time into your workflow without having to go to an input, a select, and then the append. But I want to show you the fact that, or remind you, and then give you the example of the fact that this date time that comes out of this function is the date time that each record went into the formula and not the overall date time of the widget running. Because as you can see here, looking at very quickly, you see the date time now is at 12 seconds and the date time 1 coming out of the function is at 14 seconds. So it actually took it 2 seconds after it started this workflow to go ahead and bring the data, first record of data through. We can look and see to a degree that this is not a bad way of doing it. It's just not perfect. If you go into a browse window, you can click on the to pane, which allows me to look at date time now and allows me to go ahead and look at current date time. You see they each have only one record, or only one value for all the records, and they are a different value. It just so happens that this workflow is so fast that it takes it less than a second to run through all of the records within the formula, and that's where it comes into using the crew macro to show you a little bit of how this works. So once you've gone through, and let's go ahead and pop that up very quickly so you can see. If you come into the link that I provided, you'll see this is the Alteryx community post about the crew macro. You can click on the product here. And it knows that this is a third party maintained outside of Alteryx, but the Alteryx community fully supports it and uses it like myself. If you click on that link, it will take you into the installation link so that you can download and install that within your Alteryx. Once you've done that installation, it will show up as one of your categories up here, the crew macros. The one that I use most often, as well as I use a few other ones along the way, is I started using them because the parallel block until done is much more useful and works in much more situations than the Alteryx version of block until done. This one has 1 input and 3 outputs. It doesn't work in all situations. It tends to not do exactly what you want in some circumstances. I have found that the crew macro for the same thing, which is their parallel block until done, has 2 inputs and just 2 outputs. It works in much wider range of situations and usually does exactly what I want it to do. We also have the blocking test that is useful, and I've used this and explained it to some people that this is a good way to abort your workflow if a certain situation occurs. And there's some information, documentation on how that can work. If you have questions about it, please subscribe, give me a comment and a like, and go ahead and ask me some more details if you need them about the blocking test so you can abort a workflow, and I can put together an example for that. But what we want to use here is the crew macro, and we'll come over and look at my workflow over here, which is the wait a second macro. If you notice, the very top part of this is the same workflow, but what I've done here is after this first timestamp, I've gone ahead and selected off just simply a reduced number of records. In fact, I've just chosen 5 because what I'm going to is to delay each record as it passes in the workflow or passes through this widget. It will delay for 5 seconds. So that, and keep in mind that is per record and not for the entire workflow. So each record will delay for 5 seconds. It will add a second timestamp to it, and then once it's done that, we can now look at our output, and you can see that for these 5 records, so after we click down here to the current date time 2, which is down here, click, there we go. You see that we have 5, where'd all my values go? Date time now, current date. Oh, we just checked going for the further step. Let's go back into DateTimeNow 2. We'll explain that little workflow piece in a minute. DateTime 2, here we go. You can see that it has 5 unique values. Each one of these happened 5 seconds after the previous one, which shows you that if you're counting on this having the same value for every record within the same workflow, you need to be careful, because if the workflow takes a period of time to bring records to that formula, it will reflect the time that that record actually hit the row that was passing through the formula. And again, I just used the crew macro to slow down each record. Second thing we're going to look at here very quickly is we also looked at another one, which is the DateTimeToday. What that returns you is today's date. Even though I chose it as a date time, you see that it comes out with just simply the current date. So that is the second date time formula we want to look at. It just gives you today's date. Again, need to be careful. If you're running this workflow just before midnight and it takes a while for every record to head through to your formula, you may get 2 different days in there. I decided not to stay up till midnight and go ahead and test this to show you, but I'll just leave it to your imagination and your own testing. So we have introduced 2 of our date time functions. We have the date time today, which returns just the date of today, and we have the date time now, which returns the overall date time stamp, which includes hours, minutes, and seconds. So you get 2 different things you can add to your workflow through your formulas. The next little bit of fun that I had with this is, we'll look right here in the middle part of this workflow, and that is where if you look at the DateTime functions, the parameters that you use to specify which piece of the DateTime you want to use for a DateTimeParse or a DateTimeFormat are a bit esoteric, and it's good to just have this list to look at, to refer to. Again, I bookmark this page, come back to it regularly. You also can do a few other additional things that can help you in your processing. If you use OneNote, which I do extensively within Microsoft Office, you can cut and paste that information out of there, and this is possibly a quicker way to reference it if you go to OneNote and you can share this OneNote page. I decided to go one step further just because I was having fun at the time, and that is I went ahead and pasted that spreadsheet worth of data into a text input widget. If we look at our input output, we have the text input. I just pasted that into there, which made it in this format. I then ran it into an Alteryx YXDB, and therefore I have that information here in a more dynamic format. Not actually going to use it in a workflow, it's just a reference. And one thing I want to show you is how can you use that reference? Well, quite simply, if you come into your File Explorer window, and we put mine in my workflows, you can see here I have my DateTime function specifiers YXDB. If you double click on that, you may not know this, but it goes ahead and pops up a nice little window that is the YXDB or the internal Alteryx database file. So then I can just click on that, have this window open to refer to, slide it off to the side wherever I need it, and it makes it as a quick little reference here as well. That just gets that information at my fingertips a little bit quicker and some more methodologies, and I always manage to be able to find it then. So that is 2 quick looks at the beginning for what you can do with DateTime, as well as a little bit about the crew macros and about the format specifiers, which we'll be using in some more of our workflows and functions to show you how the DateTime can work. So before we get started with the DateTime functions, or continuing on with the DateTime functions, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. If you notice that I put a tool container on my workflow, and I put this delayed first timestamp, second timestamp process inside of it. One of the reasons that I do that is so that I'm happy with how this works. I don't want to take that time to run this. I also don't want to take it off of my workflow because it's part of the discussion. But I can just simply disable it by clicking on that left corner. And you can see that it is now disabled. And when this runs, I have that open. Too many things going on at one time. We'll go ahead and close that. We looked at it just previously. There we go. And now it does not actually run through this process, so I don't have to wait for it to be completed with its time delays. And then we can scroll down and begin to talk about DateTime functions within formulas. And again, there's a lot of places that you will be using or can be using functions. I'm just using them within formulas because it's the easiest way to have this discussion. So within this workflow that is now disabled, we looked at generating dates and date time stamps. The second thing we want to look at and to get rid of from the discussion is looking at how to get date and times out of your textual data. Different systems like to put data in different orders. As far as the structure is concerned, sometimes you get just a month and a year and other constructs such as that that you need to turn into a date. And how do you do that? Well, you do that quite simply with the DateTimeParse, as you can see here. And what I've used is a text input where I have 2 different formats of dates and times so we can show you what some of the conversions or interpretations will be. And again, just to remind you, that is going back into this list. These specifiers tell you what the different types of dates and times are. Now, one thing I've talked in the very first version of this about learning a little bit more about functions as I went through this, it's always good to go back through and to repeat what you've done in the past just to understand what's going on. I noticed something different as well that had been a bit irritating to me in the earlier versions of Alteryx, and since I didn't bother checking the documentation every time I use functions, somewhere along the way they corrected what I considered to be an oversight, but I learned to live with it, so I handled it. And that is that when you're dealing with the day of the month or the month as a date, it used to require you to have 2 digits in order to convert it out of the format, so that if you just simply had a 1 for a day or a month rather than 01, it would give you an error. And so I used to have to go to some extra processing to get 2 digits in there in case it was a 1 digit that I was receiving. I noticed when I was getting ready to go through this presentation and was looking at this layout that I saw that it said 1 or 2 digits, ignoring spaces. In other words, a 1 or a 01 works the same. And I went and basically said, that's too good to be true. I really didn't believe it, but being me, the thing to do was to test that. So you can see that within these 2 different formats of dates, I have a mixture of single digits and double digits, both for the hours and minutes and seconds, as well as for the months and days in both these different formats. And I was extremely happy to see that the documentation was correct, which I assumed it was, but I needed to prove it, and so therefore I can parse it out. So looking at how this works from the DateTimeParse, we'll look at both of these and just make them bigger so that we all can see them quite easily. You can see that the DateTimeParse takes in a text string, even though I called it date1. If we look here at the metadata for the data coming in from this, as text input does, don't forget you can come in here and look at metadata and see if they are strings. Undo the metadata because otherwise I'll forget to do it later. Making this big again so that we can all see it. There we go. So it brings in a text string, and then we must give it a string that tells it how to convert the characters into a date. So %d is the day of the month as a number. This is the month number. That's a 4-digit years. They're separated by dashes. There's a space. There's the hour, a colon, the minute, a colon, and the seconds. And again, seeing the data come in, that is what it looks like. And then it converts it actually into a date. And I made sure that I gave it a data type of date time. The second one is something a bit more IT-ish than it is coming from a typical tool. And that is, again, we have the 2 digits for the day, or 1 digit as you see looking at the data. We then have the month as a text string, which is a 3 characters. Actually, since it also can do with 2 characters, but I always like to make sure there's 3 characters for the month. Case does not matter. As you can see from our example, we made them sort of standard, but they can be either upper or lower case or any kind of mixed case. And then we have the 4-digit years with nothing separating them. We then have a space. And now what we have is the 12-hour. Again, I forgot to mention this is a 24-hour hour. And this is the 12-hour hour, followed by a colon and then the minutes. And then %p says that the AM and PM comes at the end, as you can see by this data here. And then it can correctly converts this into the nice date and time that we needed. So that's it for actually bringing the data in. Let's look at the manipulations of dates in the next part of this. So we're going to do this in 3 steps just to keep it fairly short and so that the actual output does not become too long to easily interpret. I also added comments in here, and I decided to get a little bit tricky to show you how you can nest your function calls. Trying to make sure we can see the output as well as the formula. So given comments, this again 2 slashes is comments, and what we're going to look at is here embedded in the middle is that we are going to take and do the DateTimeAdd. Add is where you can increase the value of your date or decrease the value of your date. As you notice down here, we can look at both of these. This is the same, but all the numbers are negative, so we're actually taking time off of the value as opposed to adding date and time to the values. And you can give it any one of these values, singular or plural. We can add or subtract years, months, days, hours, minutes, or seconds. Again, singular or plural, and case does not matter. So we want to add 6 seconds. And to that, once we've added that, we want to go ahead and do a DateTimeAdd to that. Added date time 5 minutes. 4 hours, 3 days, 2 months, and 1 year. And you can see what we do is we start out with this as the initial DateTimeAdd, and then we put that as the value inside of our date time, and adding our extra parameters there. So this way you don't have to do this one step at a time. You can. I could have decided to do it all at once. So I simply add seconds. In the subtract date time, we went ahead and added the -6, -5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 to get the date and time going backwards. And you can see that if we look at starting with birth date, here is our beagle that was born 2020 November 10th, and as we added to it, they became a new date of 2022 01/13 at 04:05:06, since it's hours, minutes, and seconds. Subtracting off of it, going back the other direction, we've taken off time and we've taken off days, months, and years, and so the 2020 11/10 has gone back to 2019 09/06, and the other values have changed accordingly, and the time going backwards to be 1954:54. This works equally well again if the numeric value that you're giving it for the change in the date time is another attribute within your workflow. You can do that as well. It does not have to be the constants. Let's go ahead and format our date and time. Let's make these 2 smaller. We don't need them right now. So if we want our output, and then we're going to take our date time and turn it into a text field, we again want to supply it with a string that tells it what the construct of that string should be. In this case, we want to give it a year, 4 digits, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, a period, and then hours, minutes, and seconds. And that gives us the date time as text, which really looks quite numeric. There's a couple of ways we could have gotten a number out of this. Someone might say, why don't you just simply convert this date time text string into a number? And the answer is you actually can, and that would probably be the way that I would do it, but I decided to go ahead and show you a numerical calculation involving it, the manipulation of the date time, and bring in a couple of other of our functions to do that with. So there is a function DateTimeYear. It returns you the numeric year from a date. DateTimeMonth gives you the numeric month. DateTimeDay, hours, minutes, and seconds, gives you those components. If we want to combine them together into a nice looking numerical format, then we can start multiplying at 10,000 and working our way down to one, whatever that happens to be, tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, tens of billions. Anyway, and you get the point. And so what we get out of that, setting that to a fixed decimal, you can see that we have converted the date into that number that actually matches the text. So there's two ways that you can get to that. Your choice. How complicated, how sophisticated do you want to be? What is it that you're trying to do? But just to bring in these additional date time functions, they do the same thing as a DateTimeFormat, because we could just pull the year out with that, but we can also pull those out directly. If it's easier for you to do that, it gives you a number back all the time. You don't have to worry about the formatting of it. Putting that far behind, let's look at some of the ways that we can manipulate our dates. Making these a little bit bigger. We have the date time difference. It gives you the difference between two dates. And it tells you how to calculate the difference between them as far as what to do. So we take a look at the training date and the birth date. We want to say years. And we can see that there is 1 year between these two. It's not actually counting anything to do with months. It's just simply counting whether it is at least a year. If you remember our integer functions, we had the floor associated with a numeric value, and so this is actually doing the floor. So if this is more than a year, it's 1. If it's less than a year, it's 0, and you can move on from there as well. If it's more than 2, it's a 2. If it's more than 3, it's a 3. So we can see that we have 1s and 0s between the birth date and that. You notice this is not a floating point number. I let it try to do that as a floating point just to show you and me that it doesn't give you any fractions. It simply does an integer and does the floor of the integer. You can, when you're looking at the difference, you can give it year, month, days, hours, minutes, and seconds, just the way that you would do it in the other functions that have a unit as its measure. Some other things that are useful when you're doing some types of calculations: date time first of the month. This gives you, notice there's no perimeter going to it. We'll also look at last of the month. There's no perimeter. This just simply says what the first of this month is. So the first of the month now is February, January, February, March, April, May. It's Monday, people. May the 1st, notice that the time is 0000, and the last of this month, because this is May 31st at 23:59:59. If you want to find the first of the month of a value, the last of the month of the month as a value. Let's go ahead and minimize these. We'll bring them up further up the top. We have the trim function, one of the very nice to use ones. People will show you some really funky calculations to determine how to do some of this, and we're going to do actually one of those weird calculations later. But right now, just a simple basic one is if I want to know the first of the month for the training date, I just do a time trim to first of the month. There are other parameters that we can give it, but I don't find them to be all that useful, and I just figured I'd just show you the first of the month and the last of the month because they're the ones that I use most often. So since our training date, here we go, training date is 12/1, the first of the month happens to be 12/1/000, the last of the month is 12/31 at 23:59:59. And if you slide down through this data for a little bit, we'll get out of, there we go, here's the training date of 1/21, and it becomes 1/1 for the beginning of the month and 1/31 for the end of the month. And again, since I made it as a date time, it also gives me a time part of that as well. If you want to go ahead and find the first of the year, you would do the date time trim, training date to the year, and that shows you the first day of the year that you're currently in. So for all of these that are 2022, it's 22/01/01 is the first day of the year. And if we go down into, well, I think at the beginning is the 2021s, it gives you the first of that year. Simple ways to find some information. Date time trim, very useful for finding those ranges and finding out where you are. And finally, we just have one more, which is what is the end of the year? You can't directly get to the end of the year, so it's something that you're going to have to come to one of those weird little functions that we talked about. So what we do is we date time trim the birth date to the year. As you know from here, the date time will become the first day of the year. We will add 1 year to it. We embed that into a DateTimeAdd. It's the parameter. And what we want to do is we want to add a year to that to get the first of the next year after the birth. And then we take and use that embedded in another DateTimeAdd, and we take off 1 second. So that takes us back to the very, very end of the birth year. Find the beginning of the birth year, go forward 1 year, go back 1 second. It's one of those fun calculations. And as such, we end with the end of the birth year. As you can see, 2020, 12/31, when their birth date was 2020, 11/10. So this shows you how you can begin to do those calculations and get more sophisticated. I avoided some of the sophisticated functional constructs. If you're uncomfortable with doing this, we talked about this, I think, in part 2. Go ahead and back and watch part 2. We talked about doing that 1 step at a time. You could do this calculation first as 1 step, and then add each of the other calculations as a new step in your formula, and it would give you that answer as well. It will be as quick and efficient as doing it this way. It all depends on how your logic and your thought process goes. So that's the end of part 3. We've talked about not all of, but pretty much all of the date time functions. There are a lot there to help you with. In the previous 2 episodes of this, in part 1 and part 2, we talked about other functions. Alteryx has a lot of functions that you can use in your multi-row, in your generate row, in your formulas, in your macros, and your apps, as well as in your filters. So don't shy away from them. Don't think that you have to create them all yourself. Alteryx provides you with some really good building blocks, if not the complete answer that you need. I hope this helped you. I know it helped me because it made me revisit all the functions, found some new functions I hadn't seen before, as well as saw some updated versions of functions that will make my ongoing development a whole lot easier. If you like this or just like any of my videos, please subscribe so you know when I get them released. Drop me comments and tell me that you like them. Otherwise, have a great day. Check back later for another video. I do these regularly.